Okay, we are going to get started. Welcome everybody to our EDA Stakeholder webinar. This is for our fiscal year 2019 disaster supplemental. And we have a lot to cover in this webinar, so we are going to get started. Doug may join us at some point, but I am going to get started right now. Talking about our notice of funding and all of the particulars related to our webinar. So these are our goals for today, and I will say that we have already helped you with the third goal, which was understand where to go for additional information. On the bottom of this slide, you will see the URL that will link you to all of the information that you might need regarding this funding announcement. You could also just go to our homepage, eda.gov. There's a moving carousel of pictures. I think the second picture is about the supplemental. You can just click there, and that will get you to where you need to be. The fourth goal here, some of you may be familiar with our disaster supplemental funding from last year. We are in a unique situation where we have two disaster supplementals open at the same time. So one of the things we are going to talk about today is what are the similarities and what are the differences between these two funding opportunities. And so as many of you are directly experiencing, we are seeing an increase in the severity and frequency of natural disasters. This includes prolonged rainstorms, floods, hurricanes, and wildfires. In 2017, we experienced a historic year of weather and climate disasters with a total price tag of over $300 billion. Last year's disaster supplemental covered the major disasters that occurred in 2017. In 2018, one of the 2 years covered by our new supplemental, we experienced the fourth highest total cost of damages from natural disasters, with costs over $91 billion. To note, not all of the disasters that are on this NOAA slide are declared as major disasters, and thus, not all of these disasters are eligible for EDA disaster funding. So please consult the FEMA website for eligibility, and we'll be discussing that website a little bit later on in the webinar. I just want to say, while the news may move on from a disaster after a period of months, we know that to many, their lives have not gotten back to normal. In this disaster supplemental, we have the chance to assist individuals and communities from the impacts of 2 years of disasters. In 2018, that includes some of the major disasters that you may have heard about, such as Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Florence. I recently was in Northwest Florida and had to see directly the changes that were going on there as a result of Hurricane Michael, which included many economic damages to the agricultural industry, with timber being the hardest hit. We also know that 2018 was a bad year for fires, for wildfires. Fortunately, as I understand it, the current wildfire season seems to be tempered a bit compared to last year. So let's hope that continues throughout the season. In 2019, and as I mentioned, this supplemental covers 2 different years, 2018 and 2019. Flooding started in earnest in March, as heavy rain fell on frozen ground already bearing much winter snow. In South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa, traditional defenses that communities had in place to protect against rising waters were quickly overwhelmed. In some cases, farmland in the Midwest could not be planted in the spring due to the impacts of flooding. This has cascading effects throughout the economy in states where the agricultural industry is such a large economic driver. And so I want to talk a little bit about economic recovery and economic resilience. EDA has a unique role in disaster recovery, and we have a laser focus on both economic development and economic recovery. EDA, on behalf of the whole Department of Commerce, has been charged with coordinating economic recovery. And what this means is that we help to integrate the expertise of the federal government to help local, state, and tribal governments and the private sector to sustain and rebuild businesses and employment and develop new economic opportunities that result in sustainable and economically resilient communities. We take this focus on economic recovery and resilience into all the work we do on disasters, whether through a mission assignment from FEMA, whether through our core funding programs, or through a disaster supplemental. Hand in hand with economic recovery is economic resilience. Our ultimate goal in our recovery work is economic resilience, helping to make things better than they were before, building back better for the future. Resilience is an important consideration in our grant competition. A report from the National Institute of Building Sciences, or NIST, which includes data from EDA, HUD, and a few other federal agencies, found that for every dollar spent on federal grants aimed at disaster resilience and mitigation, society saved $6. That's a 1-to-6 ratio. This return on investment is higher than previously thought. The challenge is, however, we don't always know what the future holds. A 100-year flood of the past might not now occur twice in one decade. It is important to be as informed as possible about local conditions, the types of risks and hazards that regions and communities may be faced with, and how these vulnerabilities affect local economies, local businesses, supply chains, and how people get to and from work. Another way that EDA helps in disasters is through our existing authorities, our existing funding, and of course, our existing relationships with regional economic development districts and organizations around the country. This is important to note, as an applicant may not be eligible for our disaster recovery funding streams, but their work might be able to be supported by another EDA program. And EDA's planning program, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or the CEDS, has content guidelines that emphasize the requirement that resilience to natural and man-made disasters be incorporated into the development or update of CEDS documents. One example is our Seattle Regional Office awarded a grant to Guam for the development of a comprehensive economic development strategy. Guam lies in the direct path of frequent tropical storms and typhoons and will benefit from having an updated CEDS and a chance to strengthen their economic resilience. The second way that EDA assists in economic recovery and resilience is part of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. The NDRF is when the full federal team brings their resources to the table to lead a coordinated recovery effort. and our staff is very highly valued in these ground actions. In fact, these are pictures of some of our field teams that have assisted. On the left is a photo of our field coordinators in Hurricane Harvey. On the right is our team in Puerto Rico. And the third way in which we help is through disaster supplementals. Since the early 90s, EDA has received a total of $2.5 billion in disaster supplemental appropriations. Of this, $1.2 billion was received over the last 2 years. We are continuing to make awards on our 2018 supplemental that covers 2017 disasters as we launch the application process for our new 2019 disaster supplemental. So, for a quick overview, this is the same amount of money as we had last year. We were appropriated $600 million, of which $587 million is available for grants to assist communities experiencing economic distress and harm resulting from a series of disasters in 2018 and tornadoes and floods occurring in 2019. So this year, as I mentioned before, we're covering 2 years of disasters. For 2018, our funding covers all major presidentially declared disasters, a broad definition as we had with last year's supplemental. But as you will note, the eligibility for 2019 disasters is more nuanced. For 2019 disasters, only areas impacted by major disasters involving tornadoes or floods are eligible for funding. To note, floods or tornadoes may be combined with other incident types, such as severe storms, straight line winds, landslides, mudslides, as long as floods and or tornadoes is included. And we're going to go into more detail on this a little later on in the webinar. Additionally, you may be interested to note that floods and tornadoes that are declared major disasters after the release of this NOFO are eligible to apply for funding. So we encourage you to look at our Notice of Funding Opportunity, Section C2, to see a description of eligibility. EDA awards its disaster supplemental funding through its regional offices. Thus, it is very important that you know which regional offices represent your state. Regional contacts are listed in our Notice of Funding and also on our website. At the end of this webinar, I will show you a map so you have a sense of which regional office services your particular location. EDI has allocated $587 million to its 6 regional offices based on several considerations, including, but not limited to, congressional intent. So those were the disasters that we saw in a previous slide that were particularly called out by Congress in the legislation. The level of the disaster's economic impact and level of economic distress in affected areas. Please note that when appropriate, EDA may exercise its discretion to adjust the allocations to the regional offices based on its experience in administering disaster supplemental appropriations. And so the objectives of our legislation allow us to be quite flexible with our granting. We can use our money and award our money for both planning as well as implementation activities. Implementation activities may include construction, loan funds, resilience activities, and a host of other activities we will further discuss. EDA recognizes the importance of planning for long-term economic recovery and resilience, as well as the urgent infrastructure rebuilding needs that exist in disaster-impacted regions. So in terms of eligibility, who can apply, these eligible parties should be familiar with individuals that are familiar with EDA requirements, and I think consistent with that of many other federal agencies. Many different state, county, and city political subdivisions of a state would be eligible. Indian tribes or consortium of tribes, district organizations, meaning regional districts of multiple local governments, universities, and nonprofit organizations. Please note, for-profit organizations are not eligible to apply. So applicants who already are receiving an EDA award are still eligible to apply. One thing to note, however, is those eligible for our 2018 disaster supplemental are not automatically eligible for this pot of money. Those eligible for the 2018 pot of money will need to meet all the requirements of the 2018 NOFO, which includes a proposal stage and a proposal review stage. To apply for the 2019 funds, an applicant needs to meet all requirements of the 2019 NOFO. And in the 2019 requirements, there is no requirement for proposal. There is just one application process. What I listed on the slide is a small example of some places around the United States that are eligible for funding in both of our disaster supplementals. For example, Butte County, California, unfortunately, suffered from wildfires both in 2017 and 2018. Buchanan County, Iowa, had severe storms, tornadoes, straight-line winds, and flooding in both 2017 and 2018. Cumming County, Nebraska, had severe storms, tornadoes, straight-line winds, and flooding in both 2017 and 2018. From what I understand, there are about 21 counties in Northern California that would be eligible for both supplementals. 18 of them are for flooding earlier this year, and the rest are for wildfires. So one of the most critical differences between this year's supplemental and last year is the eligibility definition for our 2019 disasters. As you will note, for 2018, we cover all presidentially declared major disasters, similar to what we did with our supplemental last year. However, for 2019, eligibility is more specific and narrow. And please also remember, if you are proposing a construction project, that the project needs to be located in the county impacted by presidentially declared, the eligible presidentially declared disaster. Now, as I mentioned before, the FEMA website is really the best source of information. And what I walk you through right here is what it will look like and how you find what you need. So the searchable database is quite simple. It's fema.gov/disasters. And when you get to that page, it will ask you quite a bit of information. It will ask you for declaration type, incident type, when it began, when it ended. When you are doing this sort of search, you don't need to fill out all of the fields, but you do need to fill out some of them. So for example, we have reviewed before that only declared major disasters are eligible. There could be a few other types of disasters that are declared by FEMA, such as emergency declarations that happen before an event and at the early stages. We are looking for the major disaster declaration. So that needs to be highlighted. And obviously for 2018, you're looking at 2018 disasters. To note, it is possible that a disaster that occurs at the end of 2018 might not actually be declared till the next year. So you might not even see that declaration until the next year. But you want to specify when the incident began. And for 2018, please specify 2018, whatever state you want to look up. And then it will show you, if you click on the link, to a map, and you could see which actual counties received that declaration. And just to note, the color coding system is really meant for FEMA. It explains who gets public assistance and who gets individual assistance. That doesn't matter to us. So any shading or color is fine as long as it is a major disaster, as long as it's highlighted one way or the other. I also want to point out at the bottom of the table, for those who like to play around with data, there is a table of raw data for disaster declarations that you can fool around with to find what you need. Now, for 2019, it gets a little bit more complicated, and as we discussed, the eligibility is narrowed to floods and tornadoes. Floods and tornadoes, however, could be accompanied by other incident types. So as you can see below, in Illinois, this declaration is severe storms and flooding. If it was just severe storms, it wouldn't be eligible under our requirements for 2019, but this flooding declaration makes it eligible. Same thing over here for Arkansas. Here they've included tornadoes and flooding. And in Oregon, we have flooding. So those are examples of disasters that would be eligible for our 2019 disaster supplemental. If this is confusing, please feel free to write a question in the chat. And so how can our funds be used? The categories of projects are similar to the categories of projects in last year's supplemental. That includes creating new businesses, accessing private capital investment, job creation and economic diversification, and promoting market access to goods manufactured in an impacted area. Toward the end of the webinar, I will show you a few actual grants that we gave out using last year's supplemental to get a better idea of the kinds of projects that are eligible. And so eligible projects do include public works and infrastructure. That could be restoration of infrastructure, hardening of infrastructure. It could be new infrastructure, including high performance, flexible, nature mimicking, and resilient infrastructure and buildings. In terms of what we mean by resilient projects, just a few examples here. That could include state-of-the-art building codes and development practices, more resilient infrastructure, and redundancy in infrastructure. There's an increasing body of research showing the economic development value of resilience. Cedar Rapids, Ohio, for example, made significant investments in increasing their resilience through extensive community-based planning efforts, flood control infrastructure, and neighborhood revitalization since their devastating floods of 2008. And these investments are paying financial dividends with increased resilience to floods and also greater economic growth. The picture on the left is Hoboken, New Jersey, and that's a rendering of a resilience park that also includes a lot of stormwater storage. And on the right is a rendering of a resilient corridor in the New York, New Jersey area, and these are post-Hurricane Sandy. And so I want to review two very, very important overlays for our funding. The first is EDA's investment priorities, and the second is what we call the disaster nexus. EDA has 5 different investment priorities, and an applicant will need to show a connection to at least one of these investment priorities. But obviously, if your project is supporting more than one, then that would be worth also mentioning in your application. The second is the disaster nexus, and that is a 1-page narrative in length that makes the connection between the project and disaster resilience and recovery. These are both important considerations for your application to ensure it is both complete and competitive. A little bit more on what we mean by the disaster nexus. If an area has experienced a declared major disaster, they will need to show the connection between the proposed project and activity and the eligible disaster. So for example, as we discussed before, for those areas of the country where they might have had disasters in 2017 and then also in 2018-19, it will be particularly important for them to draw the line between the project and the disaster, which will then help determine which pot of money they will want to apply for. This is another way to show the disaster nexus, which shows that a community's post-disaster needs and their long-term vision for economic recovery and resilience truly lays the foundation for the project. The project is coming out of the event, coming out of the community's disaster recovery needs and long-term vision. I'd like to talk about match for a moment. We have a match requirement this year, as we did last, but with some additional clarity. We will begin with the assumption of an 80% match, which was typically the actual match for our 2018 supplemental. On a case-by-case basis, EDA could increase its funding and lower match. There could, however, be factors that may cause EDA to fund projects at a grant rate that is lower than 80%, meaning match requirements could be higher than 20%. When we talk about EDA's work, we're always talking about projects in the context of a regional vision for economic development. These projects are not isolated, but rather come out of strategic thinking and strategic planning. So the applicant needs to demonstrate how the proposed project aligns with the region's strategic plan for economic development. Applicants should demonstrate, if they do not have the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or CEDS, how their proposed plan aligns with an alternative plan or a combination of plans. And they should explain to their, in their application, what these plans are and how they satisfy that requirement for alignment. Some examples for what could be considered as alternative strategy documents would be another regional economic development plan, a regional comprehensive plan. More and more regions and states are developing resilience plans, adaptation plans, and then there's the FEMA hazard mitigation plan. And in certain disaster sites, so for example, in Florida and Texas, under the FEMA National Disaster Recovery Framework, long-term recovery support strategies, which tend to include an economic recovery chapter or section, also might lay out some fundamental regional goals and visions, and the applicant might demonstrate how their proposed project is aligned to those documents. Another area where we are bolstering up just a tiny bit is our effort to avoid duplication and facilitate leveraging. So EDA is aware that there are many other federal agencies and other funders that are funding in this same space, disaster recovery and resilience. That could include USDA, that could include HUD, that could include FEMA. And to reduce the confusion that might result, the competition for match, and just to keep us aware of opportunities to leverage, we know that some other agencies have a lot more money to give out than we do. We have requested that applicants indicate if other federal funds have been secured or requested for any portion of the project for which EDA investment is proposed. So that helps us avoid duplication, which is illegal, to sources of federal money paying for the same thing. We also ask how the EDA investment will complement, leverage, or align with other public and even private funds, because we want to see where there may be a possibility for a transformational project or initiative funded by many agencies, where one might cover one aspect, another might cover a different aspect, and as they say, the whole is stronger than the sum of the parts. So we ask applicants if they are going after other federal funds or even private funds for a piece of work that touches a piece of work they are going to us for funding. So for example, if an applicant is considering a building, a particular building, but there is another agency that might supply some infrastructure to support that building, we would like to know the federal program name and contact information. That helps us to be as efficient as we can from the federal perspective to make sure that taxpayer money is being used well and that we're leveraging each other's money. On the bottom here is the link to an individual we call a regional integrator, each of our 6 regions, in addition to the excellent economic development representative, EDRs or EDSs, that you may all be working with in the field. We have regional integrators who can who stay abreast of multiple sources of funding. So they may be aware of the money coming down from USDA or NOAA or HUD and can bring that conversation into an application process. So don't hesitate to reach out to your EDRs. And so on that note, I just wanted to point out that some of our sister agencies are putting an increased amount of money to help communities meet future catastrophic challenges by making investments in resilience and mitigation. And I cited two examples here. These are not the only examples, but these are very, very large pots of money that are coming available from two of our sister agencies, HUD and FEMA. And these present additional opportunities to our stakeholders for leveraging and aligning. Yesterday, I heard a briefing on the FEMA BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, which is really a strengthening of their pre-disaster mitigation grant program, which they had previously, but it will be bolstered up with new money. And that program, I understand, has the ability to generate an average annual pot of $300 to $500 million per year, with a possibility of more following a year with a particularly catastrophic set of disasters. So this money can be used for resilient infrastructure and other resiliency projects. To note, the FEMA BRIC funds will not lose their federal identity and thus cannot be used for match for most other federal grant programs such as EDA. CDBG, on the other hand, can be used for match, and this block grant money is awarded to the lead grantee in the particular state, territory, or locale. I also wanted to call out some of our sister bureaus here at Department of Commerce. You might recognize some of these logos, and it's quite amazing that we have such a variety of bureaus under the DOC umbrella. Several of these bureaus provide resources and technical assistance in issues related to disaster recovery and resilience. For example, in the recent disaster supplemental appropriations, NOAA had received $11 million for assessments and removal of marine debris from impacted areas, $150 million for fishery disasters that cause severe economic harm in coastal communities, and $50 million for emergency grants that are being managed through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And so that's the second bullet here. And there is a deadline. If you're interested, you might want to look into it right away. Congress provided to NOAA through a cooperative agreement to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to manage the funds, $50 million in funding to address emergency coastal resilience recovery. So the Emergency Coastal Resilience Fund was established to increase the resilience of coastal communities located within federally declared disaster areas impacted by Hurricanes Florence, Michael, the Typhoon Yuta, and wildfires in 2018. And their proposal is due in November. So I strongly encourage you to look into that source of funding. I know also that the department has declared some fishery disasters that helps make, recently, I think it was just yesterday, which also helps make money available, disaster funds. So unlike many other agencies, EDA accepts applications on a rolling basis until we have our money expended, and we are accepting our applications electronically. You can apply to grants.gov. And in terms of the review process, as I mentioned previously, with this disaster supplemental, you'll probably be pleased to hear that We require only one single comprehensive review. We fondly call it the IRC, the Regional Investment Review Committee. And on the next page, I am going to show you the criteria for review. And I ask you to pay close attention to the 12 criteria listed on these, the next two slides, against which your application will be reviewed. And they're actually similar to last year's disaster supplemental criteria as listed in our NOFO. And several of these criteria we have already reviewed today. So for example, we've talked about the NEXUS. We've talked about the responsiveness to the needs of communities. We talked about number 5, the alignment with the regional CEDS or CEDS equivalent. We talked about the feasibility of the project and the importance of matching funds. And there's some other fairly standard requirements. I'm going to switch to the next slide. And obviously the impact of the relevant disaster, so the needs statement. The ability of the project to foster job creation and promote private investment. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have a laser beam focus on economic recovery and economic development. So that is an important theme to touch on in all aspects of this application. We're also looking for projects that can start quickly. And then, of course, we're looking for the ability of the applicant to manage the finances and all the aspects that come with a big or even medium-sized federal grant. Number 11, we've talked quite a bit about resiliency. So that's the extent to which the project will enable the community or region to become more economically diversified, prosperous, and resilient. And to EDA, we talk about resiliency in terms of economic resiliency. It covers some of the traditional kind of physical resiliency that some other agencies are focused on, but it also adds a layer of how would the economy be able to bounce back after another disaster. So we talk a lot about economic diversification. We talk about workforce. So it'd be, if you're not familiar with our definitions, I would suggest that you look at our economic resilience guidelines as part of our CEDS planning process. Those would be helpful. And then, of course, we are very focused on regional economies and collaboration. So that is an important part. These are all listed in the notice of funding. So you can look for them there. And this is our criteria for our planning grants, our strategy or planning grants. And they have 7 special criteria, several of which we talked about before, the NEXUS with the major disaster. We talked about increasing capacity, so that is tied to disaster resilience. Number 5, the investment priorities. Number 6, of course, the ability of the applicant to actually successfully implement and complete the project. And the extent to which the project demonstrates support from regional stakeholders. That is particularly important. So for example, if you are proposing a regional planning process, it's important that we know that the region is behind this effort and they'll be able to start it, and it will be an effective effort. So what I'm going to do is just highlight some of the issues we've already talked about. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time. I'm going to pick up the pace so we make sure questions can be answered. So what's different between our 2 NOFOs? Actually, most of it is quite similar. What is different is with the 2019 There is no proposal review. With the 2018, it was a two-phase review. In the 2019, we're asking for electronic submission. And we've reviewed a lot the differences in requirements for 2018 and 2019 disasters, the more nuanced eligibility for 2019, limited to floods and tornadoes. The more robust, somewhat more robust expectation for coordination and leveraging, and I had reviewed that previously. Just quickly, these are some awards that we have given out using our money from 2018, and all of this is listed. Much of this is on our website, just highlighting a few projects, one in Texas, to help repair damage to this Marine Sciences Institute. One in Panama City Port Authority, and which is will help resiliency of business operations by reducing product damages resulting from natural disasters, and that's in Florida from the aftermath of Hurricane Irma. I want to highlight this award that will help the municipality of Culebra with a renewable energy project. It will promote the growth of emerging sustainable energy industries and their energy resilience and diversification. And then I wanted to highlight, this is a smaller one. I know a lot of our infrastructure awards are bigger. This is a smaller one to Harris County Flood Control District in Texas. And what I find interesting about this project is it's all about innovation. They're supporting a feasibility study because they wanted to see how they could take the stormwater around population centers in future storms. Obviously, if their feasibility is successful, they might want to come back to EDA or to other sources of funders to actually fund this project. But I think, as we discussed, when we're talking about resilience, we're talking about innovation. We might not have all the answers yet because it involves doing things in some cases differently than we've done before. So the idea of doing a feasibility study or a pilot study to kind of test a practice or test a concept could be very worthwhile as we get deeper into the field of resilience. I want to go back to that initial learning goal of letting you know where to go for follow-up information, and we will post these slides, and assuming the recording comes out okay, we will also post the recording on our public website. We have a web page that links to both of our recent disaster supplementals. The URL is up there. You may be interested in seeing this particular link. We have a table of the grants that we have made through the supplemental. Right now it's limited to the 2018 granting. As we give out grants on the current supplemental, we'll include those. And this table is updated periodically, so it may not have the latest grant. For the latest information, I highly recommend you look at our press releases. For many of our awards over, is it 100,000, 500,000, 500,000? For many of our awards, we write press releases, and you can learn a lot just by looking at our press releases, and then you could sort for disasters. And these are some websites that you might find handy. And we mentioned the 6 regional offices. And just so that you know, the Northern Mariana Islands is covered by Seattle and Hawaii, as well as Hawaii.
And Guam.
And Guam. And, sorry, that's my contact information. And I'm part of the Economic Development Integration Group. And you can also email me directly at nfriedman, spelled right here, nfriedman@eda.gov. And now we're ready for questions. I think we've already been getting questions, so I'm going to turn to our team here. Are there any that, I know you've been answering a lot of questions by chat. Are there any that you want me to talk about on the phone?
The first question was, the most predominant question was there any guidance on why Congress limited the 19 funding to Florida, or to floods and tornadoes? And the answer is no, they just did it. It was as enacted for all 2018 major disasters, and then floods and tornadoes in 2019.
And Philadelphia covers Virginia, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, Philadelphia covers Virginia.
And there was one question just about other disasters that happened in 19, because there was, for example, a specific question about the Rizmont, California earthquakes. If they're not floods and tornadoes, they're not covered by the supplemental. That is not what Congress gave us permission to do.
The interesting thing is, what we noticed is, first, there tends to be an emergency declaration where the governor is really asking to have access to federal resources through the storm and the emergency and response stage. And then a major declaration may come in, and sometimes we don't know until that major declaration comes in how that particular storm will be declared. It's also possible that a storm could be declared in one way, and then weeks later there could be related events. So for example, a storm could be declared as a hurricane, and weeks and weeks, even months later, there could be flooding that was precipitated by the hurricane, but then contributed to by other factors. And the same county could then get a flood declaration. With a flood declaration, they would be eligible. I know it's unusual, but keep in mind that disasters, we are in September, so they're disasters that are declared in October, November, and December, as long as they meet the flood and tornado requirement, would still be eligible.
And to determine whether it is a flood or a tornado that is eligible for us, again, go to the FEMA website and look at the description. If the word tornado or flood is there, it works. If it's not, it doesn't. So we just got a question, for example, about a suspected tornado that was associated with a hurricane. If that declaration doesn't include the word tornado, then no.
And so we are going to, in a couple of days, put the slides up on our external website. I think we will send a blast out when we do that, so folks know when those are posted. Assuming this recording came out okay, we will also share the recording. That will be available on our website. I see a question that came in. Could a nonprofit apply for funds?
You already answered.
You answered it?
Yeah.
Well, you answered here. Great. Are there any questions that we did not answer? Heidi said she didn't see the answer to that question. Maybe we should.
For the nonprofit?
Yeah.
It's specific to her and her.
Oh, okay.
We actually said specific, for specific grant questions and concerns, please contact your regional office.
Okay. Okay, so we're at the 4 o'clock hour. As we said, we are available But I would say that your regional offices, and we have provided those contacts to you in several ways. Your regional offices are really the best source of information. I would highly recommend that you contact your regional office. If you click on that link, it will take you to your regional disaster recovery coordinators. You can also contact your regional directors, your regional economic development representatives. These people are extremely helpful, and they're all about wanting to help and wanting to answer your questions. So we're very, very lucky to have you on the phone today. I hope this was informative. We will be posting information on our website. Don't forget to check out our new FAQ. It was posted last week, frequently asked questions. You might find that informative. And thank you. Thank you for joining us today.